10,000 years ago, as the great monument-building cultures of the Near East thronged with activity. Clans of complex hunter-gatherers already beginning to settle down and experiment with agriculture for millennia. At the far northwestern periphery of Europe, Ireland had no inhabitants. The mountains, bogs, and great old-growth forests which then coated its shores, standing empty, quiet, save birdsong and the wind. But across the water to the east, where lean hunters at low tide had looked out across the narrow stretch of sea, covetous eyes began to hold it in their gaze. On clear days, protruding from the sluggish sea, still chilled by glacial flows released by the retreating ice sheets of the north, they saw the outline of another land, where the round skyfire slid down into the endless ice-bound ocean. Though they couldn't have known it, that place over the horizon was Europe's last landmass. Beyond lay nothing but the endless churn of the Atlantic. From that vantage point on the wind-lashed shore, piercing blue eyes surveyed the horizon and the expanse of dark hills on the far coast. Until one day, they made the leap. Could this foreboding place be their new home? They were going to try. At many times, this dark isle had been visible to the Mesolithic seekers as they moved north with the changing season. But their own lands were places of plenty, and they had long clung to their own coast, occasionally ranging across the bays on makeshift vessels and venturing out into the fish-teeming estuaries. Seafood could be speared, shellfish gathered, and birds' eggs scavenged from the higher sea cliffs. But still, the other land seemed to call to them. Those dark, looming mountains, rising up beyond a narrowing strip of sea, the skyfire burning beyond. And finally, after edging many days further north, the seekers could clearly see its limits in these low hills. It was too much for their curious minds to resist. Once again, they will seek out another land. These seafaring folk have ranged further north on past occasions, exploring the sea locks and inlets where the land succumbs to the cold, and vast barren mountains rise up from the shore. But only a few bold pioneers in other clans have crossed to the dark island that lies beyond their regular hunting grounds. Their visits have been brief, seasonal forays, venturing a short distance inshore, trespassing on an eerily quiet land, devoid of people. It seems a hostile place, they say, closed off from the familiar abundance of nature. despite the rangings of the most elite and patient of the hunters. No herds of deer have been sighted in the grass clearings, nor forest boar lurking in the shadowy woodland. The explorers are resilient. They have sharp minds and strong physiques, well adapted to the extreme. In time, they will finish what nature has not yet achieved in that strange place, bringing new life themselves. Their treasures are already being loaded on the shore. In wickerwork baskets, little piglets squeak. Leather sacks are filled with edible snails. Overseeing the preparations for the crossing, the leader of the extended family has sharp features, straight black hair and piercing blue eyes. The distinctive genome of his people. The Western hunter-gatherers. From a high sand dune he stands watch. He will keep vigil throughout the dark, alert for dangers, keenly observing how sparks of light track across the sky. He looks up in wonder. The sky dome still glows with traces of orange fire, but he knows that soon another sky fire will blaze up somewhere behind him. Close by, but not at the exact place from where its predecessor was fired out like a thrown stone. Gradually, it too will progress to the far side of the land, from where it will sink below the hills. Whatever happened to the skyfire, it happened out there. As the small bright sparks of light begin to shine above him, they spin around in shapes he recognizes, changing as the great herds move through the river valleys. These patterns of stars will one day hold the secret of navigation. When finally another skyfire rises on the hillside behind him, he wakes the group, and the small party of Mesolithic seekers prepare their hide-skin craft for the crossing. There is a brisk offshore wind, and the short passage across this narrow sea will be accomplished before the pale sun reaches its zenith in the dim sky. These people are the prime ancestors of the North Europeans. His little party is no more than an extended family group. As they carefully climb into their small craft, they wonder what strange gods or animal spirits await their presence in the silent land. This place was a gift, but it is an empty one. They are the first of many to make this crossing and populate this green territory. Other footprints will tread inland, but these Western hunter-gatherers are the first people to walk upon its shores and remain there. Over the 5,000 years to come, these very earliest Irish men and women will be followed by many more. This is the story, not just of how Ireland was settled by those distant ancestors, but how it flourished into one of the most strikingly affluent societies in all of Europe, at the very dawn. My name's Pete Kelly. You're watching History Time, and this is the story of the first people in Ireland. In prehistoric Ireland, information about the wider world was extremely hard to come by. Impossible, even. Today, we have the complete opposite problem. An onslaught of information coming at us all day, every day. Much of it complete nonsense. And that is where the sponsor of today's video comes in. Ground News is a website that gathers together and presents to you a wide range of verified news articles from all sides of the political spectrum, so you can compare them and get context as you take in your information. I got a chance to download the app and use it myself over the last few weeks, and honestly, in this world of echo chambers and media bias in the news, this is a brilliant way to find out what's actually going on. For each news event, you can see all the sources covering it around the world. Ownership details of these publications, factuality ratings indicating credibility and subjectivity, as well as insights into which countries are or aren't reporting on it. One of my favourite features of Ground News is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories overlooked by one side of the political spectrum, thus generally helping to challenge the echo chambers we find ourselves in. Not only does Ground News bring to you all the world's news in one place, but by accessing the hard data behind the stories, you can compare and absorb them critically. So head on over to ground.news/HT and use my link to save 50% on the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. This is their biggest discount of the year and only available for a limited time. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. This episode of History Time was written and researched by historian and expert in the ancient world, Dr Raoul McLaughlin. I've left links to his excellent books in the description below, as well as his YouTube channel. And now, back to the prehistoric world. There was good reason for the hardiness of the Western hunter-gatherers. Before their time, our ancestors had been at the total mercy of the environment, with each all-enveloping ice age potentially lasting 100,000 years. All we could do was move, adapt, and survive. During the Pleistocene era, the entire upper echelons of the globe were coated by a vast glacial mass reaching deep into the European continent. For Northern Europe then, the last glacial period was an era of perpetual winter, at the edge of an immense ice frontier. The enlarged ice caps locked up so much of the Earth's water that sea levels fell. The oceans pulled back from the shallow coasts to such an extent that land masses were joined by ice-bound causeways, stretches of sodden wasteland, or strips of bleak tundra. Ireland existed in the front line of this glacial expanse, and during warmer periods, when the ice retreated, Parts of its southern coast were exposed and connected to the European mainland. In the gradual cycles of environmental change, these warmer periods could last 10,000 years, before the glaciers would once more creep forward to envelop the land, extinguishing all life. About 40,000 years ago, the Earth's climate shifted dramatically, the glaciers beginning to thaw and retreat from the northern reaches of the Earth. As the ice withdrew, plants recolonised the exposed terrain. Hardy animals crossing over land bridges in their wake to enter new tundra-like regions on the edge of the ocean. In this era, known as the Upper Palaeolithic, new human populations expanded across Europe, interbreeding with and ultimately replacing their Neanderthal cousins. In time, the pairing of these populations created a new kind of human, who possessed enhanced powers to envisage, innovate, and adapt. For the first time in Europe, these new people, often known as Cro-Magnon, had a basic biology and cognitive ability comparable to our own. They are therefore referred to in genetic studies as early European modern humans, being directly preserved in modern populations today. In the interglacial periods, as the ice withdrew, life became abundant, new foliage spreading across previously barren lands. Today, the fossilised bones of prehistoric wildlife confirm the habitat and denizens of this prehistoric landscape. Some we would recognise from Ireland today, others not so much. Ancient varieties of geese, hares and Arctic foxes being joined by lemmings and even spotted hyenas, all alike crossing over the now passable land bridges. These early pioneers would occupy and populate the jutting headlands of Europe, places that one day would morph into the land we call Ireland. Soon, larger creatures too came to range across these bitterly cold grasslands, including woolly mammoths, red deer, reindeer, and the creature known by its Latin name as Megaloceros giganteus, the giant Irish elk. Prehistoric predators followed. First grey wolves and brown bears, and finally Cro-Magnon man. These earliest hunter-gatherers were shorter and stockier than modern Europeans. But figurative cave art found at sites such as Lascaux in France confirm their focused imagination and inquisitive intellect. By 35,000 years ago, Cro-Magnon people were occupying those stretches of southern Britain which had been exposed by the retreating glacial ice. Their remains are preserved in deep caves that withstood eons of erosion and severe environmental changes. They were a sparse population, living on the very edge of existence, hunting reindeer and other large prey vital to their survival. When the herd demanded it, parties of these Cro-Magnon hunters would follow the reindeer migrations further west to explore the ice-clad fringes of what would one day become Europe. Though this was then a landmass with no clear boundaries, at some point the hunters moved into the territory that would one day become Ireland. Evidence from Castle Pook Cave in Cork confirms their presence, but traces are still incredibly rare. The remarkable finds from Castle Pook include the hind leg bone of a reindeer, displaying deeply cut tool marks. The animal having been butchered using a broad flat tool characteristic of Cro-Magnon man. The bone was dated by radiocarbon analysis and confirmed the presence of the first people in Ireland 31,000 years before our modern era. It is matched by not too dissimilar finds from Britain. But the Ice Age had not finished with Ireland. From around 26,000 years ago, the late glacial maximum marked the last stage of the Pleistocene epoch. As temperatures plummeted, the ice once again surged south, forming new glaciers as it went. All life was first exiled, then excluded, and anything or anyone left behind, extinguished. This final ice age in Ireland is known as the Midlandian era because of its astonishing impact on the Irish Midlands. That final assault of ice sheets, scarring and sculpting the landscape we know today into its present form. With the land coated in glaciers up to 2,000 feet high, by around 25,000 BC, these mountain-sized sheets were studded with boulders and abrasive gravel. The advance and subsequent retreat of these ice walls would gorge out the glens of Antrim and scoop up the U-shaped valleys of the Wexford Mountains. In Sligo, the highest peaks protruded from the massive glaciers known as nuntacks, while the abrasive ice scored and sculpted the tall rock faces below into formidable and perplexing forms. Gravel-filled rivers at the base of melting glaciers created long, sinuous ridges rippling across the Irish landscape. Elsewhere, the ice moulded the southern counties of Ulster into a belt of rolling, domed-shaped hills known as drumlins, also dropping huge, incongruous boulders known as erratics, and scooping past volcanic plugs to create escarpments such as Scrabo Hill. In the face of this advancing wall of ice, the surface beneath buckling under the grinding action of the glaciers, all signs of life were eradicated. As the relentless ice edged slowly across the entire surface of northern Europe, animals and humans had no choice but to retreat. Some 23,000 years ago, humans abandoned southern Britain. To endure and survive, retreating southward in search of more tolerable climates. The diminished populations withdrew to regions in southern France and Spain, the so-called glacial refugia. Here, conditions were severe, but still within the limits of endurance for plants, animals, and people. Northern Europe now lying beyond the range of human settlement. In the refuge regions of Europe, where cave painters etched their thoughts on rock surfaces, the cold and the scarcity worked on human minds and bodies too. Populations dwindled, hunger increased, and competition intensified. In these hostile conditions, only the most resourceful, physically fit, and mentally adept would survive. The ensuing changes included a unique gene mutation to reduce a dark pigment in the iris of the eyes. Perhaps this offered a slight advantage in perceiving colour gradients in dim surroundings. Or perhaps it improved endurance, since it reduced the depressive effect of low-light environments. Or perhaps it gave the human hunter a faster response awareness as he chased his prey along frozen terrain in the dying moments of daylight. But whatever the cause of this adaptation, for the first time, our ancestors began to watch the world through distinctive blue eyes. And so, a population known now as the Western hunter-gatherers emerged within that uniquely challenging environment. For more than 7 millennia to come, the final surge of the Ice Age saw the glaciers reach their maximum extent. Then, once again, the climate shifted, and the ice retreated from the Atlantic shores of Northern Europe. Human populations again followed the gradual expansion of plants and animals into a new tundra-like environment, near unrecognisable from the one their predecessors entered so long before. Finally, around 15,000 years before our time, the Western hunter-gatherers reached southern Britain. In this era, immense quantities of water were still locked up in the glaciers, causing the ocean to retreat and the seabed to become traversable. Animals grazed along sodden marshes that would one day form the depths of the Irish Sea. The hunter-gatherers followed this prey, eventually crossing tenuous corridors leading from the continent to Ireland. Warming conditions having finally left Ireland ice-free. In time, humans will walk once more upon the solid surface of its terrain. Food is scarce. They enter the cave to hunt a dangerous prey in the silent darkness, or seek shelter from the increasing cold. In the period from 12,000 to 9,000 BC, a progression of plants and animals spread north to recolonize the land. Life crept along the land bridges, seeding a 300-mile corridor of low terrain, connecting the continent to the new Irish peninsula. Pollen evidence indicates that by 11,800 BC, the bleak tundra had become open grassland. Within 500 years, Ireland had its first cold-resistant trees. Willow bushes and stunted junipers, which could thrive in barren clays and gravel-heavy soils. The trees spread from south to north, suggesting that the life-bringing land bridges extended directly from continental Europe. Next came small species of animals that fed on grass, including sleek prehistoric hares. Larger animals followed once again, including reindeer and giant Irish elk. Herds of these animals migrated great distances and grazed their way across the land bridges to repopulate the new peninsula. By about 11,000 BC, these animals reappear in Ireland, and with them came the first large predators, including wolves, bears, and man. Confirmation comes from a limestone cave in County Clare, where the prehistoric knee bone of a butchered brown bear was recovered during underground investigations. This remarkable find from the Alice and Gwendolyn cave has confirmed that in around 10,800 BC, Ireland was inhabited once again. A prehistoric person had used a stone tool to sever and scrape away the tough tendons that gave the bear its muscular power and strength. These sinews were usually treated and used as cord to sew together the thick hides worn by these early hunters. They could also have been used to bind sharp-bladed flint tools to wooden handles, or fix the stabilizing feather fins to hunting arrows. The type of weaponry the hunters needed to survive in such a hostile environment, haunted by such ferocious animals as wolves and bears. Perhaps these early inhabitants of Ireland withdrew into caves to avoid the severe cold. Or maybe they had found a hibernating bear during the prolonged and worsening winters. Perhaps the strongest of the group had entered in the darkness to corner and kill this impressive beast. Or maybe this animal had been hunted elsewhere for its meat and hides and brought back to the cave to be butchered. The remains might therefore reveal an epic combat between man and nature in an utterly unforgiving land. Whatever had occurred, the corpse was a trophy to be processed and stripped of every useful aspect of its anatomy. All across the globe in that time, as the first temples and permanent settlements began to thrive in the warmer climes of the Near East, the hunters of the northern fringe were expanding into the regions left behind by the glaciers. In the same era, another group of humans, distant cousins to the Western hunter-gatherers, the ancient North Eurasians, were crossing the Bering land bridge from Siberia into Alaska. Ranging across a newfound continent of plenty. Soon, cut off from the rest of the world, and embarking on their own completely unique path. In time, they would become the Native Americans. But in Ireland, those first Western hunter-gatherers to occupy this land would not be so fortunate. They had reached a dead end in their westward expansion across Eurasia. Their presence on the western edge of the supercontinent was fragile and limited. Yet again, some 12,000 years ago, during the Younger Dryas period, there was a resurgence of the ice. Temperatures plummeting once more. Yet again, the hunters withdrew from these fringe territories as their prey became extinct, or shifted their long-term migratory patterns. This was the era when the giant Irish elk finally disappeared from Ireland, never to return. Their kind had once occupied a vast swathe of Eurasia, from Ireland to Siberia. They had thrived in a tundra-like landscape. But in the final stretches of the Ice Age, they could not evolve nor adapt with sufficient speed. The elk's own body chemistry could not maintain the effort of supporting such enormous antlers it required for combat and display. Victims of their own anatomy, starved of nutrition, the species finally succumbed to environmental pressures, becoming extinct. The giant skeletal exhibits, proudly displayed in modern Irish museums, are a testimony to their prehistoric struggle. Recovered from ancient bogs, these massive skeletons reveal not only the power of nature, but the ever-possible outcome of severe and rapid changes in the climate. During yet another millennium of severe winters, the glaciers reappeared on high ground, in both Ireland and Scotland. And though brief, this final encroachment of the ice was sufficient enough to once again remove most animals from the land, including humanity. When warmer conditions finally resumed, for good this time, Ireland was still connected to the continent through broad land bridges that could seed and sustain trees. From around 9,500 BC, at the dawn of the Holocene, birch trees are found, followed by other ancestral species that would form the roots of the native Irish forests that still survive today. By contrast, only a few rare creatures had survived this final cold period. Recent genetic analysis confirms that Irish hares in particular possess extreme genetic diversity, suggesting that they might have been isolated from the rest of their species for far longer than other creatures. These hardy hares could be among the oldest Irish animals. When the Ice Age finally ended, the retreating glaciers melted into vast swollen streams, pouring immense quantities of water back into the oceans. Across the globe, the rising seas encroached upon the land, swamping low-lying terrain and creating new islands. The disappearing land bridge between Ireland and Europe first became a low-lying expanse of salt marshes, sandbanks and mudflats. These wetlands were in turn gradually inundated and submerged. As the climate of Ireland improved, permitting a new abundance of life. The restoration of Irish biodiversity became a race across a sinking landscape, with very few plants and animals able to make the journey. Populations of mice and pine martens were the first small animals to arrive in Ireland. Recent genetic analysis suggests that these animals might have come via the continent rather than neighbouring Britain. But many species did not make the crossing in time. For example, Ireland still lacks certain creatures that burrow for their food, such as the mole and the common shrew. These small mammals could not survive the marshy conditions or tolerate the still frigid temperatures if they survived the journey. Ireland also has fewer amphibian species than Britain, and some ecological barrier or filter seems also to have halted the progress of snakes and other reptiles. Perhaps it wasn't St. Patrick after all who banished the snakes from Ireland, but the Ice Age, followed by sudden rapid flooding of the land corridor to the continent. As a result of these great changes at the dawn of the Holocene, with fewer native plants and only half the species of mammals of its neighbour, Ireland lacks the biodiversity of Britain and the continent. Crucially, the encroaching seas did not permit the passage of red deer and wild boars, the principal prey of the western hunters. But as the warming climate permitted the spread of grasslands and the growth of forests, the island did become bountiful. Nuts, fruits and seeds floating or blowing across the waters. The lakes and rivers on the new island also thrived as the waterways received migratory fish such as salmon, trout and eels. But where were the humans? One calm morning around 10,000 years ago, a small family group of hunter-gatherers is about to make the western crossing. At the low expanse of dark hills on the far coast, blue eyes surveyed the horizon, gazing out across the narrow sea. At the end of the last ice age, the adjoining habitats of the Atlantic coast were submerged beneath rising tides. One territory lost to the sea at that time was the prehistoric expanse of Doggerland, a large boggy region once situated in the North Sea, between the Thames and the Rhine. In its prime, it was a mass of sandbanks, beaches, lagoons, salt marshes and mudflats. A thriving wetland, providing a rich and diverse hunting ground for its human inhabitants. The estuaries and rivers were filled with fish, wildfowl and small game. But before this habitat was finally submerged in 6000 BC, its peoples had already departed on their hide-skin craft to surrounding shores. It is not until 9000 BC that Ireland appears as a distinct island, with a size and shape resembling its current confines. Perhaps there was a similar prehistoric habitat in the wide depression that currently forms the Irish Sea basin. After all, over a third of the Irish Sea is less than 120 feet deep. Peat deposits recovered from the seabed, nearly 70 feet below current shorelines, reveal the existence of ancient forests, as do the beaches of Wales. Like Doggerland then, this could well also have been an environment that was destroyed by rising sea levels, its people being displaced onto the surrounding shores. At the heart of the Irish Sea then, the Isle of Man might be all that remains of a now submerged greater landscape. Once a highland plateau, peeking out over the low plains. The earliest people of Ireland probably made the short yet nonetheless daunting sea crossing in hide-skin craft, or large dugout canoes fashioned from single tree trunks. Their craft probably resembling the umiaks constructed by modern Inuit peoples. Watertight skins stretched out over a basic wooden frame. Though strong enough to carry a large hunting party, or an entire family, including their basic possessions. The Antrim Hills on the north coast of Ireland are an abundant source of flint. So, prehistoric seafarers may have visited these shores long before the island was permanently settled. These crossings would have been short, because the intervening sea had not yet risen and expanded to its current dimensions. Due to the shifting shorelines and tendency for hunters to hug the coast, the earliest evidence for prehistoric people has mostly either been eroded by tides or submerged in sediments. The earliest evidence for the new occupation of Ireland that finally stuck comes from inland sites dated to about 8000 BC. But something extraordinary had to occur before the interior territories could support significant communities. Ireland had to receive a population of wild pigs. Across northern Europe, the hunters sought large game, with red deer in particular being a favoured prey. Although Irish rivers teemed with salmon and eels, there were no large prey like deer in its grassy hillocks and dark forests. Prehistoric deposits at Newlands Cross near Dublin revealed a collection of early land snails close to the coast. These mollusks could well have been introduced by seafarers visiting the Irish estuaries. It's not out of the question to ponder whether these visitors seeded the island too with other species, including oak trees to produce acorn crops, providing sustenance for squirrels, mice, badgers, wild boars, and sows. When the land was ready, these early settlers seem to have captured wild pigs on the far shore to release them into the quiet Irish woodlands. These Mesolithic proto-horticulturalists may have finished what nature could not accomplish, seeming to deliberately shape a new land in preparation for their own permanent settlement. In time, the rapidly propagating pigs provided a meat source for the coastal hunters, who could then finally range further inland. Eventually, they abandoned coastal migration entirely in favour of permanent inland occupation. These people became the first Irish. In modern-day Poland and Belarus, wildlife reserves like the Białowieża forest have managed to preserve a number of ancient habitats that resemble the primeval old-growth forests of prehistoric Europe, offering botanists, zoologists, and prehistorians a glimpse into the lost world of the Middle Stone Age, while providing evidence for the population balance and character of the earliest animals of the Holocene. Bone remains from Mesolithic Ireland confirm the presence of hare, wood mouse, red squirrel, stoat, pine marten, otter, wildcat, lynx, and the wolf. But the first remains of bears only occur later in the Mesolithic, at occupation sites such as Moyna Loch in County Meath. Is it possible then that people deliberately introduced this species too, for its fur perhaps, releasing captured bear cubs into the Irish woods? Surviving prehistoric remains suggest that Mesolithic populations were highly mobile and sparsely settled on the land. Anthropology too offers comparative evidence with other hunter-gatherer groups like the early populations of Tasmania. Based on this information, early Mesolithic Ireland may have held a total population of less than 4,000 individuals. These small communities would have relocated over the course of the year to take advantage of seasonally changing resources, spending much of their lives in solitary bands, with perhaps only intermittent meetings with other groups for trade and marriage. Early Mesolithic tools have been found at about 20 prehistoric sites in Ireland. These include scatterings of skillfully made stone implements, chippings from flint working, traces of fire, and small waste heaps of animal and fish bones. The remains of temporary camps where family groups gathered to take advantage of seasonal resources. This early evidence is intriguing because Irish flint blades do not resemble the toolkits and weapons found in neighbouring Britain. Perhaps survival in Ireland required a different assemblage of equipment. As deer did not yet exist on the island, there were fewer hides to be scraped, and no antler horns to be utilised for tools. So, life in Ireland required a different set of survival skills. Its population, therefore, rapidly acquired an entirely separate cultural identity. Most of the Irish tools are microliths, tiny, minute flint blades, made into geometrically shaped barbs that could be slotted into the wooden shaft of an arrow, a harpoon, or a spear. Other microliths are needle-shaped points that have been studied for microscopic wear, revealing a range of functions, including fishing and sewing. Larger implements, including flint axes for butchery and adzes with perpendicular blades for working wood. Though we can't say much about the symbology and even religion of these earliest of Irishmen, the Mesolithic hunters undoubtedly spent significant amounts of time polishing stone axes to produce an aesthetically pleasing smooth surface. Very likely being used as a sort of decorative, ceremonial item. At Mount Sandel, near Coleraine, in the far north of Ireland, evidence of habitation is seen in a series of excavated huts. Radiocarbon dating suggests an occupation period close to 7000 BC. Post holes revealing the outline of a slightly oval structure some 18 feet across, formed by bending hazel rods or birch poles into a domed frame, then covered up by brushwood or hides. In the centre of this large hut was a hearth that had been repeatedly used. Interestingly, the structure had been restored and rebuilt several times during multiple prolonged periods of occupation. Likely over several generations. Ethnographic analogy suggests that this home provided seasonal shelter to a single family. Perhaps one of many huts that were clustered on Irish hillsides during times of abundance. In the Killera cave in Limerick, the remains of two Mesolithic Irish people were found from about the same era. Two other cremation burials were recovered at Castle Connell, also in Limerick. One grave pit containing the cremated remains of an adult male, buried with a polished stone axe and two microliths. His grave had been marked by an upright post. Several centuries later, another solitary cremation was deposited in a second pit near this gravesite. Perhaps this was a resting point on some seasonal route of migration along the River Shannon toward its broad estuary. The Irish Mesolithic era, or Middle Stone Age, lasted for more than 4,000 years, from around 8,000 to 4,000 BC. For over 4 millennia, Western hunter-gatherers were the first and only inhabitants of the Emerald Isle. Even now, a significant part of their genetic character remains encoded in current European populations. Today, many modern Irish with their dark hair, including champion sports stars, political leaders, and visionary poets, observe the world through that same genetic marker of blue eyes, forged in the apocalyptic cold of the Ice Age. But today there is a great deal more DNA than just the hunters. For by 4000 BC, newcomers would arrive, altering the island irrevocably forevermore. As the first hunter-gatherers moved into Ireland, the Near East was already in the midst of the so-called Neolithic Revolution. Having already experimented with new ways of producing food for millennia, by 8000 BC, throughout the wide arc of Western Asia, known as the Fertile Crescent, settled agriculture of both plants and animals had been widely adopted. This paradigm-changing new way of life involved not just the cultivation of grass plants that produced simple grains, but the rearing of domesticated animals too, including short-haired pigs, primitive breeds of sheep, goats, and diminutive cattle. Over the centuries to come, as clans grew in size and ideas spread, farming practices from Mesopotamia and the Levant spread northward to Anatolia. The large landmass jutting into the Mediterranean and extending along the Black Sea coast toward the eastern edge of Europe. From ancient times to recent years, Anatolia has always been a nexus of communication between continents, and the prehistoric past was no exception. Gradually, as the 8th millennium BC progressed, the previously hunter-gatherer population of Anatolia abandoned or adapted their previous ways of life, beginning to farm the land. It was these Anatolian hunter-gatherers, the builders of such Neolithic metropolises as Çatalhöyük and Eşikliğöyük, who would become the first European farmers. Though it would take work and time, several generations in fact, for crop selection to produce plant forms that could manage and thrive in the more northerly climes of the European mainland. When they first arrived on European soil by around 6500 BC, those Anatolian farmers must have been quite a shock to the locals. With a physically distinct and separate look from the population that occupied most of Europe. Genetic markers reveal that the Anatolian farmers had tanned skin, brown hair, and hazel-coloured eyes. Unlike the hunters, however, the adoption of farming by the Anatolians was a population multiplier, allowing their expansion from the eastern periphery of Europe across the entire continent in a relatively short space of time. Settled communities produced far more surviving children, born in closer succession to each other. Population pressure therefore encouraged descendants to push outwards and create new homesteads on unclaimed lands. As a result, farming spread with remarkable speed across Europe, sometimes adapted by hunter bands, but largely conveyed by the descendants of the much more populous Anatolian peoples. By 6500 BC, the first European farmers spread into mainland Greece. Their settlements there can still be seen at sites like Sesklo and Dimini. And from there, they crossed the Mediterranean to colonise its various coastlines and islands. Within just a few centuries, they had extended their presence beyond Italy and were settling islands such as Sardinia, where the modern population retains a genetic composition very similar to their Neolithic forebears. From the edge of the Mediterranean, they continued onwards, generation by generation, driven by curiosity and need, spreading northward along Europe's Atlantic fringe. In Spain and France, they terraformed the land, clearing the old-growth forests while acclimatizing to their new territories, always spreading agriculture where they went, through their crops, their livestock, and their population. Meanwhile, another offshoot of the Anatolian farmers had been gradually spreading westward into Europe, via the Danube and Rhine river systems. In about 5000 BC, these two population groups finally converged in what is now northern France, where their kindred cultures merged and reformed after more than a millennium of separate expansion. The coastline stretching from Brittany to the Rhine was now settled by a Neolithic people of common ancestry. Some had even intermixed with the far less numerous blue-eyed hunters on their long progress through Europe. But for some reason, their passage into Britain and Ireland was halted. Perhaps Near Eastern crops were not yet well adapted to the damp climate of the Atlantic. Perhaps it was something else. But the expansion of the first farmers into Britain and Ireland did not occur for another 1,000 years. Finally, by about 4000 BC, a rapid spread of Neolithic populations into the Atlantic Isles took place. Perhaps the Western Ocean environment had altered in such a way that it now benefited farming. Maybe a sequence of exceptional summers or climatic changes that led to prolonged, drier and warmer winter conditions. Maybe these communities simply developed and propagated new damp-resistant crops like barley. Or a combination of all these factors. However it took place, events, as always, largely shrouded in mystery. Communities of farmers who'd occupied the coastlines facing Britain finally began to cross the narrow sea, to farm the opposite shores that had been visible from their homelands for generations. A newfound confidence in seafaring spread rapidly through these Neolithic communities, and by 4000 BC, their settlements were present throughout southeast England. Within 2 centuries, the first farmers had arrived in southern Wales, the Isle of Man, and even western Scotland. Current radiocarbon dates are imprecise, but finds from Ireland too confirm the presence of well-established Neolithic farming communities by about 3800 BC. Suggesting a simultaneous expansion of Neolithic settlers from Brittany into the Irish Sea to explore and settle along its coasts. Following along the ocean currents, maritime settlers probably sailed in hide-skin craft, or large outrigger canoes that were manoeuvred by oars. At Gormanston Beach in Meath, the Neolithic remains of a giant dugout canoe were discovered, confirming the existence of outrigger vessels over 20 feet long. Perhaps these outriggers supported large raft-like platforms onto which families, seed grain, and livestock could be loaded. The first agriculturalists probably set sail in small flotillas, heading for lands visible on the horizon. As farmers, they intuitively understood seasonal weather patterns, and more distant lands could be reached by observing the path of the sun, or the position of the stars. The Mountains of Mourne and other prominent peaks providing clear landmarks for those who entered the enclosed Irish Sea. Most of the crossings undertaken by these settlers would have required only a few days to complete. Furthermore, once an overseas community was established, there would be a continual back and forth movement of people and surplus provisions between the former homelands and the new settlements. This was the migration stream that propagated and rapidly spread the Neolithic way of life across Britain and Ireland. Genetic analysis of the Neolithic Irish suggests a vibrant and healthy population, somewhat resembling the people of modern-day Sardinia. Recently, the grave of a young Neolithic woman was excavated at Ballynahatty near Belfast, and her genome was sequenced to reveal that she had a Mediterranean appearance and was largely healthy, besides hemochromatosis, a condition where the body retains excess iron. The hunter-gatherers of Ireland were different from the Mesolithic peoples of Britain, both in their behaviour and numbers. The largest prey animal of the Irish was the wild boar of the deep forest. This relative lack of large animals could have not just limited their numbers, but kept them away from sites claimed by the new farmer colonists. The first Neolithic people to reach Ireland may have avoided the estuaries where Mesolithic hunters had fishing grounds entirely. This is suggested by chemical analysis of Neolithic skeletons that show a lack of river or lake fish in their diet, though this could also indicate a possible taboo involving this particular food source. Instead of claiming the estuaries, the Neolithic settlers seem to have exploited upland regions, with better field drainage and a greater suitability for livestock. Unlike in Britain, the grasslands of Ireland had no red deer to compete with grazing animals. But because the environment was wetter, the settlers may have sown damp-resistant barley in place of other wheat crops. Though we know nothing of their first meetings, soon enough, the two worlds came together. Although skilled in wilderness survival, male hunters may have exchanged foodstuffs with the new Neolithic settlers. Based on the genetic evidence, they probably accepted Neolithic women and either joined the domestic communities or left their offspring and descendants behind in the settlements. But as agriculture spread, the farmers rapidly outbred and replaced the Mesolithic inhabitants. If the incomers doubled their population every generation, it would take only 6 generations for the descendants of just 100 adult settlers to outnumber the dwindling population of hunters. The small, dispersed population of Western hunter-gatherers was well balanced and nature-attuned, and thus easily overwhelmed as the landscape was transformed by the ever-multiplying numbers of newcomers. After thousands of generations of a roughly similar way of life then, the transition from the Middle Stone Age to the Neolithic New Stone Age of agriculture was relentless and rapid, spanning only 6 to 8 generations. Within the space of just 2 centuries, the Neolithic Revolution had introduced a new population with an entirely different lifestyle, culture, range of material objects, and belief systems. Rapidly expanding along migrational streams made up of related individuals and groups. Eventually, most of northern France, Britain and Ireland were brought into a single cultural zone with a familiar shared ancestry. Like their ancestors in the ancient Near East, as objects were fashioned in clay and fired to make pottery, this new material culture developed the first Irish ceramics, as well as new forms of stone tools suited for woodland clearance and agriculture. Crucially, the environment would also begin to change. Perhaps largely imperceptibly at first. But before long, morphing beyond all recognition. Hunting survived, of course, just as it would throughout all of human history, both to supplement the diet of the farmers, and increasingly as a status symbol. Though, as it always had been, game remained sparse in Ireland. Even more so with the burning of the forests. The new Neolithic populations of Ireland employed a different tradition of flint knapping to their Mesolithic forebears, producing distinctive arrowheads and javelin points for their hunting, while also introducing new varieties of scraping tools to process the hides and pelts of their own livestock, mostly consisting of non-native animal breeds carried across oceans and continents from the Fertile Crescent with their masters over the previous 3,000 years. It didn't take long before the old forests of pine and birch all across Ireland were cleared, creating open pastures for cows, pigs and sheep, or new field systems for crops like wheat and barley. Like farmers all over the world today, the Neolithic Irish may have practiced slash and burn agriculture, first felling trees, then burning the dried foliage to create nutrient-rich soils. Just as it is today, however, the exposed land was quickly exhausted of nutrients, becoming largely barren terrain. In time, morphing into deforested expanses like Dartmoor and the marshes of Connacht. The great impact on the Irish landscape by these early terraforming colonists is revealed by traces of field plots uncovered in County Mayo on the west coast, which may indicate how much of Ireland once looked. Dating to as early as 3500 BC. The Cagey Fields consist of parallel dry stone walls that once demarcated Neolithic fields, creating a vast amount of food for an ever-growing population. This clearing of trees, however, had an unintended side effect. causing the formation of the sodden bogland that remains to this day, eventually forming a preservative covering over the Neolithic remains, so we can still view them today. Across most of Europe, Neolithic farmers made greater use of polished stone axes than their predecessors. The tools were flaked into shape and then ground down into a smooth finish using abrasives such as sandstone. Undoubtedly prestigious decorative items, they provide evidence for contact, kinship, and exchange across Neolithic Europe. And their geological origin can be matched to particular regions in the Atlantic Isles. This distribution reveals that rather than a barrier or impediment to further population movement, communication and travel, the Irish Sea was a conduit for exchange. In Ireland, the main material for export was porcelainite, a dark, dense stone that was quarried in northeast Antrim. Over 7,000 porcelainite axes have been found in Ireland, but they have also been recovered at Neolithic sites ranging from Scotland to southern England. Another axe head production site in northwest Britain that demonstrates the long-distance exchange network of the early Neolithic is on the slopes of Great Langdale in the Lake District. This impressive axe factory supplied Ireland with a distinctive green-hued stone. Over 100 of these fine grey-green axe heads have been recovered from various Neolithic sites in Ireland. Perhaps indicating the course of migration streams, the strengthening of social alliances, or even a quest for esoteric religious knowledge. Whatever was occurring, there was a constant flow of Neolithic settlers coming and going between the two islands. It comes as no surprise that given the immense changes taking place in the 4th millennium BC, all across Ireland, the seasonal campsites of the Mesolithic disappear, replaced by larger, more permanent homesteads constructed from solid timbers. Neolithic dwellings in Britain and Ireland were long, rectangular buildings, ranging from 18 to 36 feet in length. Crowded, busy homesteads of multi-generational clans, where people lived in close proximity to each other and to their livestock. Just like in developing societies today, large families were an advantage because children of all ages could perform chores and provide labour to assist with farm work. But nonetheless, there were important regional differences in the practices of these first farmers. On the continent, where farming was more productive, Neolithic dwellings increased and developed into small villages. But in Ireland, the Neolithic population tended to remain in isolated farmsteads, or small and well-dispersed clusters of houses, perhaps encouraging a greater focus on ritual and religious centres, used as vital community meeting places for an otherwise dispersed population. Religious centres that in time would grow and flourish into some of the greatest monuments in all of prehistoric Europe. For as the 4th millennium BC came to an end, one of the great flourishings of Irish prehistory was about to begin. It had been a cold, clear night, and now a low winter mist clung to the hoarfrost on the damp grass. At dawn on the shortest day, the God King observed the first dim rays of the rising fire slant through the long stone passage of the great earthen mound. Half closing his sky-coloured eyes, he squinted into the mounting intensity of sunlight. The time of plenty would come again. Warmth and growth would return to the land. He stepped forth from the quartz chamber to the approval of gathered priests and holy men. The wind-lashed hillside was studded with huddled family groups who had come to observe the ceremony. Many of them dark-skinned with chestnut hair, their brown and green eyes the colour of the earth or the crops in the fields. Characteristic of the Neolithic farmers whose ancestors had stemmed from Anatolia long ago. But the God King and many of his priests are different. Their eyes shine with the distinctive blue of an earlier people. Because the God King had re-emerged from the mound, the cycle would begin again. The bare earth would regenerate, and the trees and bushes would bear fruit. The beasts of field and of forest would give birth again. The dark and cold turned back once more. It was a scene that played out year on year, century on century, at ceremonial sites, large and small, all over the land. As the 4th millennium BC progressed, the Neolithic expansion throughout the Irish Sea territories is characterised by the appearance of large communal structures, often including ceremonial enclosures and distinctive burial sites. Hundreds of megalithic tombs and monuments have been identified and investigated in both Britain and Ireland. For example, so-called causeway camps were large enclosures usually surrounded by a series of up to 3 non-continuous ditches and banks, crowned with timber palisades. Access to the internal space came via breaks in this outer circuit, in so-called causeways leading into the heart of the compound. Like the similarly massive Cursus monuments of Britain, the remains of cattle, domestic waste, ceramic fragments, and occasional human bones have been found in the ditches. But there is little evidence of any substantial structures inside the enclosures. The archaeology then suggests that the function of these enclosures might have been ceremonial, as a focus for cult activity or seasonal ritual gatherings. A situation seen also in many other early societies on Earth. From the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks in Ohio to the ancient Near East. It's possible causeway enclosures might have begun as defensive corrals in wooded landscapes, places to safeguard animals during the seasonal movement of Mesolithic hunters. But as the years and centuries went by, their purpose may have developed and expanded, with the ancestral gathering places becoming exchange centres for scattered homesteads. Or perhaps communal feasting grounds. Arguably, like societies all over the world, also connected to esoteric funeral rites involving excarnation. Where corpses would be exposed to the elements and scavenging birds, but free from the attention of larger wild animals, and thus given back to the cycle of nature. The bone fragments would then be removed for deposition in other ritual or religious contexts, perhaps even in the homestead itself. Many causeway enclosures were used for generations, with the site being modified, ditches recut, restored, or banks expanded over many hundreds of years. Over 70 of these sites have been identified in southern Britain, dating to about 3800 BC onwards. But they are also found in Ireland, and the causeway enclosure at Donegal Hill, Antrim, dates to this same era. Interestingly, the enclosure at Magaraboy in Sligo could date to as early as 4000 BC. If so, this site in northwest Ireland was built at the very onset of the Neolithic expansion into the Atlantic Isles. The other innovation brought by the Neolithic settlers, one of the most famous features of their world, and still a prominent feature on wild moors and hills, was what archaeologists call the megalithic tomb. The remains of well over 1,000 megalithic tombs still survive, or have been previously documented on the Irish landscape, consisting of large capstones set on top of upright stone slabs that create chambers buried within an earthen mound. The human remains of special or elite persons were deposited within the internal stone chambers, while the mound itself served as a centre for religious ceremony. Often, all that remains of these monuments is a dolmen, with stonework exposed as a large flat capstone resting on its supports, like the slabs of a giant table. Just a few survive in larger dimensions, as a shadow of their original form. Yet, revered down all the generations to come, even still today. For the antiquarians and archaeologists who've spent the last 2 centuries and more striving to unlock the secrets of these ancient tombs, the megalithic constructions and their internal designs are integral in reconstructing something of the religious beliefs of their society. During the lifetime of the monuments, inner passages, often being reoccupied to make offerings, conduct ceremonies, and admit new token remains from the dynastic elite, should someone from the chosen class die. But in this after-death existence, the ruling class seem to have been preserved only as a symbolic fragment of their former selves, joining their ancestors as a minor contribution to a vast conglomerate entity embedded into the landscape. An embodiment of identity, place and community for those still on the mortal plane. Perhaps where the vaunted ancestors could be mediated with in times of trouble, and a few chosen individuals could join their exalted ranks. In revealing the scale of Neolithic society and the levels of social cooperation that were possible within the ever-expanding population, megalithic tombs also hint at the emergence of a new social elite who could summon wider communities to aid in the construction of large labour projects. Very possibly Ireland's very first kings and queens at the dawn of everything. The largest and most famous of these Neolithic constructions is undoubtedly the site of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. This impressive visage, unfortunately restored inauthentically in the 1970s, consists of a passage grave within a 40-foot high mound, stretching for an entire acre. Within the mound, a 60-foot long stone-lined internal corridor leads into a deep chamber. A sacred place with corbelled roof and 3 alcoves. Here, the illustrious dead would be interred. Like many other megalithic tombs, and the stone circles that would largely come later, the corridor had been aligned so that on the morning of the winter solstice, the rays of the rising sun are directed down into the darkness to flood the chamber with light. A phenomenon that still fires the imagination of those who see it today. No doubt, completely blowing the minds of Neolithic visitors. The site itself would have been wildly impressive too, differing a great deal from what we see today. Quartz stones had been brought here, perhaps to form a dazzling facade as the modern reconstruction suggests. Most remarkable of all is that the temple at Newgrange is considerably older than Stonehenge, and even the Great Pyramids of Giza. Carbon dated to around 3200 BC, it remains as a testament to the productivity and creativity of the population of the Boyne River Valley, where more than 30 smaller mounds exist too. Far more than just a gravesite, only a few token remains from the chosen elite ever being deposited within its inner confines. Newgrange would have functioned both as a temple and a ceremonial centre. In some of the greatest surviving examples of Neolithic art found anywhere in Europe, large curbstones in front of the mound display the coiled symbols synonymous with megalithic art. At neighbouring Knowth, a similarly wildly impressive site, with a whole series of tomb mounds built over and over again down the millennia. The swirling patterns of Neolithic art can also be seen. The similarly impressive passage tomb at Dowth completes the main tombs of this vibrant ritual landscape of the Boyne Valley, revealing the societal scale of Neolithic Ireland and the commitment of its people to their shared religious and mythological beliefs. But megalithic tombs weren't the only monuments in this landscape, for this too was the age of the stone circle builders. One of the most important and famed Neolithic sites in Ireland still survives on the leafy outskirts of Belfast. This is the Giant's Ring. A ceremonial henge monument consisting of a vast circular bank, 12 feet in height, surrounding a central dolmen, which was the core of a small passage tomb. The entrance to this compound faces west, meaning that processions entered the sacred site from the direction of the setting sun. Nearby is another ceremonial site known as Ballynahati. Created from tall upright posts arranged in a circuit of wooden pillars. This wooden henge, like similar ones found all over Britain, might have been an open-air temple where corpses were given back to nature, placed on platforms to be devoured by scavenging birds. But this is just one idea. The reality is anyone's guess. Fascinatingly, in recent years, great leaps forward in DNA sequencing has suggested that in ancient Ireland, the practice of selective breeding may have taken place, to either accidentally or purposefully create a ruling caste with distinctive blue eyes and black hair. Genetic analysis of bone fragments removed from the most prominent Neolithic mounds reveal that the individuals selected for deposition in these elite settings had precisely these characteristics. The Neolithic remains recovered from the main passage tombs, then, may reveal the existence of a separate ruling class of kings, queens, or priests. Like many of the rulers of ancient Egypt and certain other ancient societies, these individuals were severely inbred. Remains recovered from Newgrange being from a man who was probably the product of a brother-sister union, resembling the so-called god kings of ancient Egypt, where religious cults sanctioned royal dynasties to form incestuous unions that were taboo in the wider society. The Neolithic remains of a 6-month-old baby was interred in the megalithic tomb of Poulnabrone in County Clare. The skull bore the distinctive proportions of a child with Down syndrome, confirmed by modern genetic analysis. The parents had been siblings, and their child had died at a young age. Reminiscent of similar remains found at the Tomb of the Eagles in Orkney, where disabled children had been cared for and interred in the megalithic tomb. Such individuals may have been treated as special, touched by the gods, perhaps even utilised in shamanic religious ceremonies. It's possible the ruling caste was trying to preserve a unique element in the Neolithic gene pool. If their cults were based on ancestor worship, as the evidence suggests, then they could have been trying to maintain the disappearing physical characteristics of the original Mesolithic hunters, the first inhabitants of Ireland. If this was the case, they were not successful. And by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, their way of life would begin to come to an end. For yet more newcomers would arrive on the island, bringing new genes and new technology to add to the foundations laid by the tomb builders and their hunter ancestors. For soon, the age of metal would begin. Tune in next time as clans of travellers move along the Atlantic shores to the Emerald Isle, altering forevermore the culture and genetics of the island, laying the foundations for the Bronze Age to come. When Ireland emerged from the Ice Age, it was a land granted fragile reprieve from the frozen emptiness of the north. For 10,000 years it nurtured its people. From the Mesolithic hunters who stalked the wildness, to the first invasive farmers of the Neolithic era, who raised great monuments of earth and stone. These people provided Ireland with the animals, plants and trees that have sustained and supported the island's ecosystem ever since. Then, 4.5 millennia ago, Bronze Age settlers would arrive to repopulate Northern Europe and provide Ireland with its ancestral stock. These native folk encompassed and adapted all other incoming cultures, forming their own Bronze Age traditions. Going on to develop a specific Celtic identity, perhaps infused by yet more warrior bands arriving from foreign shores. Throughout all these ages, the Irish have preserved their insular heritage and ethnic character. But no people last forever, and no homeland can survive the uncertainties of the future. Perhaps the returning glacial sheets will once again grind south to scour the surface of the landmass, enmeshing Ireland in another ice age. In time, every trace of Irish culture in its homeland obliterated beneath 1,000 tons of frozen rubble. But, of course, many possible futures await. Another, spurred on by the pursuit of profits and the effects of an ever-rising global temperature, exhausts the fertile soils to such an extent that they cannot give nutrients to the enfeebled crops anymore. Starvation and industrial pollution from chemical waste rendering vast regions of Ireland's central belt uninhabitable. In time, all that the ancient indigenous Irish have worked and strived for so long, lost and forgotten. Like footprints on a sandy shore, washed clean by the rising tide. This nation, and all others alike, swept from the surface of the earth.